On a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and filmmaker, decided to take a quiet walk down a busy street. The city was bustling with energy, the hum of car engines, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional honking of horns. Yet for Clint, it felt like just another ordinary day. At 94 years old, his movements were slower than they once had been. The weight of age and years of hard living had taken its toll on his body. But there was still a spark in his eyes, a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. He'd been walking these streets for decades, though now it felt different. The energy of Hollywood was all around him, but the place had changed in many ways. The buildings that once stood as symbols of power and fame now seemed to blend into the background, almost as if they were just part of the scenery. As Clint strolled down the sidewalk, the sound of his footsteps was almost drowned out by the noise of the busy city. His mind, however, was elsewhere, lost in thought as he walked at his own pace, unaffected by the world around him. Every now and then, people passing by would do a double take, whispering to each other, "Is that Clint Eastwood?" Some even looked at him with awe, recognizing the man who had shaped the American film industry with his iconic roles in The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly, Dirty Harry, and his years of directing award-winning films. But Clint didn't seem to notice. He walked on, enjoying the simplicity of a normal day, something he treasured more than most. The fame, the adoration, he had seen it all before. But today, none of that seemed to matter. As he moved down the sidewalk, Clint's thoughts wandered back to his early years in Hollywood, when things had seemed simpler. He remembered the old studio lots, the late-night talks with fellow actors, the thrill of the first few successful films. Over time, things had become more complicated, the world more demanding, but deep down, he never forgot the joy that acting had brought him. Now, though, he was past all of that. His focus was more on living peacefully, reflecting on his life, and doing what he could to make the world a little better. It was at that moment, amidst the noise of the street, that Clint noticed something unusual, a man sitting on the curb. He was hunched over, wrapped in a worn-out blanket. His face, weathered by years of hardship, told the story of a life that had not been kind to him. He looked lost in thought, as though the weight of the world had crushed his spirit. Beside him was a cardboard sign, crudely written, that read, "Anything helps. God bless." The sign was worn, with edges fraying from years of use, but it was still visible enough for passers-by to see. Clint's gaze lingered on the man for a moment. There was something about him that made Clint pause. Maybe it was the sadness in his eyes, or perhaps it was just the realization that this man's life was so far removed from his own. Whatever it was, it made Clint stop. For a brief second, their eyes met. "Hey, mister," the man called out hesitantly, his voice raspy. "Can you spare $1?" The words hung in the air for a moment, the sound of the city fading into the background as Clint processed what had just happened. He wasn't used to being approached like this, not on the streets of Los Angeles, and certainly not by someone in such a situation. He could feel the eyes of the few people nearby on him, some curious, others indifferent. But Clint didn't care. He stopped in his tracks and looked at the man. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other, and Clint's expression was hard to read. Was he annoyed? Sympathetic? The homeless man couldn't tell. His hand trembled slightly as he waited for a response, unsure of what to expect. Finally, Clint reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it slowly, as if contemplating something deeply. The man on the curb watched him anxiously, his eyes filled with hope, but also a hint of disbelief. It was clear he wasn't used to kindness from strangers. Clint didn't pull out loose change or a small bill. Instead, he took a crisp $100 bill from his wallet and held it out. The man's eyes widened in disbelief, and his mouth opened slightly, as though the gesture was too much to process. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice breaking with emotion. Clint nodded. "Take it," he said simply. For a few seconds, the man just stared at the money, as if it might disappear if he blinked. His hands shook as he reached forward, his fingers trembling as he took the bill. He looked up at Clint, his eyes brimming with tears. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much. Clint watched him for a moment, silent. He wasn't a man who often showed his emotions, but he was moved by the rawness of the moment. This wasn't just about money, it was about a connection. A moment of compassion in a world that could be so indifferent. But Clint wasn't done yet. He surprised the man further by sitting down on the curb next to him, something few people would have expected from the famous Hollywood legend. "What's your name?" Clint asked, his voice calm and gentle. The man blinked in surprise, still clutching the $100 bill as though it might vanish at any moment. "Oh, it's Joe," he said, his voice still shaky. "Well, Joe," Clint continued, "what happened? How'd you end up here?" Joe hesitated. It wasn't every day that someone, let alone a Hollywood icon, wanted to hear his story. But something about Clint's tone, the way he didn't rush him, made Joe feel safe. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel judged. He took a deep breath and began. "I used to have a job, a family," Joe started, his voice softening as he spoke. "I worked construction for years. It was tough, but I liked it. My dad worked construction too. It was hard work, but it was honest. Then one day, I got hurt on the job. My back, it never really healed right. The company couldn't keep me on. I tried to find another job, but my back was too bad. I couldn't do the things I used to. They let me go, and well, things just started falling apart." Joe's voice trembled as he continued. "I couldn't find work after that. The bills piled up. My wife left me, took the kids. I don't blame her, not really. Who wants to be around someone who's always angry and broken? I tried drinking to numb the pain, but that just made it worse. It's like I lost myself. I used to be someone, but now I'm just here." Clint listened intently, nodding occasionally. "That sounds rough," he said quietly. Joe shrugged, the weight of his story settling on his shoulders. "It is what it is," he said, his voice bitter. "But you know, sometimes I think, if someone just gave me a chance, maybe things could be different. Maybe if I had one more shot." Clint was quiet for a moment, then turned to face him more directly. "Everyone deserves a second chance. You're not a lost cause, Joe. You've just been knocked down. The question is, are you willing to get back up?" Joe's eyes widened. He had not expected those words, especially not from Clint Eastwood. He blinked a few times, trying to process them. He nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, I want to get back up. I just don't know how." Clint smiled faintly. "First step is believing you can. Second step is taking action. That's where most people get stuck." Clint stood up, brushing off his pants. "Come on," he said, holding out his hand to Joe. Joe looked up, confused. "Come on where?" "We're going to get you cleaned up," Clint said, his tone calm and matter-of-fact. "You look like you could use a good meal too." Joe hesitated, still holding the $100 bill, his face a mixture of confusion and awe. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, unsure of Clint's motives. Clint shrugged slightly, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. "Because I can. And because I believe in helping people who want to help themselves." For the first time in years, Joe felt a spark of hope, a small but undeniable glimmer that things might be different. He took Clint's hand and stood up. Together, they walked down the street, drawing curious looks from passers-by. But neither man paid much attention. Clint had a mission now, and so did Joe. Clint led Joe to a nearby diner. The warm, greasy smell of comfort food filled the air as they stepped inside. The place was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered around the booths. Clint guided Joe to a corner table, where they sat down across from each other. The waitress brought them menus, but Clint didn't need to look. "The usual," he said, and she nodded without hesitation. Joe, on the other hand, scanned the menu with wide eyes. It had been a long time since he'd been inside a place like this, let alone sat down to a hot meal. As they waited for their food, Clint continued their conversation. "So, Joe, tell me, what's the dream? What's your plan for the future?" Joe looked at Clint, unsure of how to answer. He had lost sight of his dreams a long time ago. But something about Clint made him think. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I guess I've just been trying to survive. I used to dream of starting my own construction business, but that feels so far away now." Clint leaned in, his gaze steady. "The road's long, but it starts with the first step. You can't climb the mountain if you're not willing to put in the work." Joe nodded slowly, taking the advice in. The waitress brought their food, and they ate in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When the meal was finished, and they were getting ready to leave, Clint leaned across the table and said, "You've got a tough road ahead, Joe. But I've seen tougher guys than you make it. Don't waste this chance." Joe stood up, his hands still shaking as he put the $100 bill in his pocket. "I won't. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. You've done more for me today than anyone has in years."